There's a number sitting inside your 401k right now, and it's not your balance.
It's a different number, a percentage, and there's a good chance you haven't looked at it since the week you started your job. That number was set automatically, on your behalf, by a system designed to be as painless as possible. Not to be as effective as possible, but painless. And those two things turn out to be not the same.
Vanguard tracks the retirement savings behavior of nearly 5 million American workers every single year. What they consistently find is that a meaningful share of people who participate in a 401k are contributing below the threshold needed to capture their full employer match.
Many are also contributing well below the 12 to 15% combined savings rate that Vanguard itself recommends for retirement readiness.
Millions of people who think they're doing the right thing are doing a version of the right thing, one chosen for them by a system that prioritized enrollment over optimization. This video is about how that happened, why it's so easy to miss, and what it costs over time if you don't catch it.
To understand the problem, you have to go back about 20 years.
Before the mid-2000s, most 401k plans were opt-in, meaning you had to actively choose to participate. You got hired, you received a packet of paperwork, and at some point you'd fill out the forms and start contributing. If you didn't, nothing happened, and you just didn't save. The research on opt-in retirement savings was not encouraging because a lot of people simply procrastinated. A lot of people told themselves they'd start next quarter, after the holidays, or once the car was paid off. The inertia of not doing something turned out to be extremely powerful, and it hurt most the people who could least afford to lose decades of compounding. So in 2006, Congress passed the Pension Protection Act, which formally encouraged employers to flip the default. Instead of making workers opt in, employers could now automatically enroll new hires and simply let workers opt out if they chose.
The behavioral logic was sound, because if inertia is the problem, you use inertia as the solution. Get people into the plan first and let the same tendency to not change things keep them there. It worked, and participation rates climbed significantly as a result.
By 2024, Vanguard reported that in plans with automatic enrollment, 94% of workers were participating.
That compared to just 64% in plans where joining required an active choice, which is a genuinely large difference. But automatic enrollment required one more decision that didn't get nearly as much public attention, and that was what rate to set as the default. If you're an HR director or plan administrator in 2006, you have a real problem to solve. You've just decided to auto-enroll your workforce, meaning money is coming out of paychecks without workers explicitly agreeing to a specific amount. If you set the default too high, workers feel the pinch immediately, and some of them opt out entirely, which defeats the whole purpose. If you set it too low, the savings might be inadequate long-term, but at least people stay in the plan and have something. The number that emerged as an informal industry standard was 3%, and sometimes as low as 2%. Low enough to be nearly invisible in a paycheck, and low enough that most workers don't notice the deduction and stay enrolled. From a participation rate standpoint, it made sense, but what it didn't account for was what happens next, or more precisely, what doesn't happen next. NBER researchers studying automatic enrollment at several large companies found something that should have set off alarms, but didn't get enough attention outside academic circles. When workers were auto-enrolled at a 3% default, the vast majority, roughly 80% initially, simply accepted that rate without changing it. They accepted the investment fund too, usually a conservative, stable value or money market option, without question. And when researchers checked back after 3 years, roughly half of those workers were still contributing at the default rate. After 3 years of employment, they had never touched the number, not once. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco published research explaining the behavioral mechanism behind this finding. Workers don't interpret an employer's default as an arbitrary starting point, but rather as implicit guidance from someone who thought it through.
The researchers called it the endorsement effect, where the plan says 3% and the worker assumes someone smarter decided this is about right for them. This isn't a failure of intelligence, but a predictable consequence of how human beings process decisions when we're busy and have limited information. Retirement savings competes with rent, groceries, student loans, and 1,000 other immediate demands, so the default feels like a reasonable answer to a hard question. And for a while, the story looks fine on the surface, which is exactly what makes it so easy to miss. Here's where it starts to break down, and this is the part most people never see. The 3% default wasn't designed around what you need to retire comfortably. It was designed to keep workers from opting out. Those are fundamentally different objectives, and conflating them has cost people real money over decades. Vanguard's How America Saves report, covering data from 2024, found that the average employee deferral rate was 7.7% that year, the highest on record. That sounds good, but here is the number that puts it in context, and it matters a great deal. Vanguard recommends a combined employee plus employer savings rate of 12 to 15% of pay to support actual retirement readiness. The median combined rate in 2024 was around 11.5 to 12%, meaning a meaningful portion of workers still fall short. Among those involuntary enrollment plans, where automatic features are less common, the average combined rate was only 7.4%. Not 12, not 15, but 7.4, which is a gap that compounds quietly and painfully over time. Now, layer in the employer match, because this is where the math becomes particularly sharp and concrete. The most common employer match formula in Vanguard-administered plans is 50 cents on the dollar, up to 6% of your salary. Bankrate, citing Vanguard data, puts the average employer match value at about 4.6% of pay. What this means in practice is that if you contribute at least 6% of your salary, your employer adds roughly 3% on top. That puts you at 9% combined just from those two inputs, which is a meaningful start toward the 12 to 15% target. But if you're contributing 3%, you're only capturing a partial match, not the full benefit your employer's offering. In the most common formula, a 3% employee contribution earns only a 1.5% employer contribution. The employer is matching 50 cents for every dollar you put in, and you've only put in half of the 6% that unlocks the full benefit. You're leaving 1.5% of your salary on the table every single paycheck, not because the money isn't available, but because the default rate is keeping you from it. That's not a market risk, it's not inflation, it's not bad luck. It's a structural gap most workers never knew existed. There's a genuine surprise buried in the Vanguard data that's worth sitting with for a moment. In 2024, 61% of plans using automatic enrollment defaulted workers in at a rate of 4% or higher. That's real progress, because 10 years ago, only 39% of plans did that, and the trend is moving in the right direction. But even 4% still leaves workers short of the 6% threshold needed to capture the full match in the most common formula. The system improved, and it's still not quite closing the gap that it created in the first place. One more piece of the picture worth naming here is about contribution limits and who actually uses them. Only about 14% of 401k participants actually contribute the annual IRS maximum each year. In 2026, that limit is $24,500, which is a meaningful amount of tax-advantaged space. Workers 50 and older can add another $8,000 as a catch-up contribution under current IRS rules. Workers between the ages of 60 and 63 can contribute up to $11,250 extra under changes made by Secure 2.0.
These expanded limits only help people who get their contribution rate to a level where those higher ceilings actually become relevant.
For workers still anchored at 3%, the higher limits are a theoretical benefit they'll likely never use.
Now, let's make this concrete with a specific scenario using stated assumptions. Not a prediction for any individual, but a model that follows logically from realistic inputs.
Imagine two workers at the same employer earning the same salary of $65,000 with the same employer match formula. The match is 50% on contributions up to 6% of salary, so the maximum employer contribution is 3% of pay. Both workers start at age 35 with a 30-year investment horizon to age 65. Worker A was auto-enrolled at 3% and never changed it, while Worker B noticed the gap and raised their rate over time. Worker B eventually reached 6% employee contributions, capturing the full employer match, and later increased to a combined rate of around 13%. For both workers, we'll use a conservative illustrative return of 6% per year, compounded annually, with no taxes, fees, or salary growth modeled. Worker A, at 3% employee contribution, earns a 1.5% employer match for a combined 4.5% of $65,000. That's $2,925 per year going into the account under this scenario. Over 30 years at 6% annual growth, that illustrative scenario produces a balance of roughly $232,000. Worker B, at 6% employee contribution, earns the full 3% employer match for a combined 9% of $65,000. That's $5,850 per year, which is exactly double what Worker A is putting in. Over the same 30 years, at the same 6% return, the illustrative balance is roughly $464,000. The difference between those two scenarios, same employer, same salary, same market conditions, is approximately $232,000. Not because Worker B earned more, and not because Worker B took on more investment risk, but because Worker B closed a gap Worker A didn't know existed. By year 10, the trajectories are different in a way that's clearly visible on a chart. By year 20, they're in noticeably different positions. And by year 30, the gap is the kind of number that changes what retirement actually looks like day to day. There's a second compounding effect worth naming, which is what happens inside the account, not just how much goes in. NBER research found that even after 3 years on the job, half of auto-enrolled workers were still in the default investment fund they were placed in at enrollment. Behavioral inertia doesn't just affect how much you save, it also affects how your savings grow over time. A low contribution rate combined with a conservative investment fund is a very different retirement outcome than a moderate rate in an age-appropriate diversified fund. Plan design has improved here, and target date funds are now widely used as defaults, with 67% of Vanguard participants fully invested in a professionally managed allocation as of 2024. But if you were enrolled years ago under an older plan design, checking your investment fund is just as important as checking your contribution rate.
Now, there's a version of this conversation that can feel accusatory. And that version deserves a serious and honest response.
Someone watching this might be thinking they're at 3% because that's genuinely all they can afford right now. And that's a fair and real response. For a lot of workers, particularly those earning lower wages or carrying significant debt, a 3% contribution isn't a mistake. It may be an accurate assessment of what's possible. Research from Vanguard shows that participation rates among workers earning under $15,000 annually are around 40%. Among workers earning over $150,000, participation rates are around 95%. Cash flow constraints are real, and they don't distribute evenly across the workforce, and that matters a great deal.
Telling someone making $38,000 a year to raise their 401k contribution can be genuinely bad advice if it means they can't cover an unexpected emergency. There's also a legitimate argument that 3% in a 401k beats 0% by a wide margin. For workers who are genuinely liquidity constrained, staying enrolled at a low rate preserves the habit and the institutional relationship, which makes future increases easier when income improves.
The honest framing isn't that everyone should be at 10 or 12% immediately, because that's simply not realistic for everyone.
It's that the default rate was not chosen for your benefit, it was chosen for administrative reasons that had nothing to do with your retirement. The question of what your rate should be is one you should be making consciously, with full information, rather than by simply not having made it yet. If 3% is genuinely your ceiling today, that's a completely different conclusion than 3% being what HR picked on your first day and you've never revisited. The outcome might look similar on a statement in the short term, but the underlying situation is completely different. The insight this video is really about isn't simply contribute more, because most personal finance advice reduces to that, and it isn't especially useful on its own. The insight is about where defaults come from and what they're actually optimizing for when someone sets them. Auto-enrollment was designed to get people into plans, and the default contribution rate was designed to keep people in plans. Neither of those goals is the same as helping you retire with enough money. Though they're related, they're simply not identical. When a system makes a decision for you about your savings rate, your investment fund, or your contribution level, it's worth asking whose problem that decision was solving. For 401k plans, the honest answer is that the default was solving a participation problem, not your retirement problem. And your retirement problem is still yours to solve. The question worth sitting with, not just for your 401k, but for any financial default you've inherited, is this one. Did I choose this, or did I just not change it? Because those two things can look identical on a statement, but have very different implications for what happens next. If you haven't checked your contribution rate recently, that's the one thing worth doing this week, and it takes about 5 minutes. Log in, find the percentage, compare it to what your employer matches up to, and then decide consciously whether that's the rate you'd choose if you were setting it fresh today. If this kind of structural look at how financial systems actually work, not just what they claim to do, is the kind of thing you find useful, there's a lot more where this came from.